Opening. In many systems, attention does not arrive all at once. It accumulates over time. A task is completed faster than expected. A problem is resolved before it is formally addressed. Something that once required oversight begins to function without friction. At first, this often goes unnoticed. Systems are not built to observe excellence, they are built to detect disruption. Competence usually remains invisible as long as it does not interfere with flow. Over time, repetition changes this. When the same outcome appears again and again without delay or error, it becomes predictable. Predictability encourages reliance. Reliance produces awareness. What begins as a skill slowly becomes a reference point. It is not maimed or announced, it is simply assumed. Work begins to be organized around it. This is often described as efficiency. But efficiency is only the visible layer. Beneath it, a structural shift takes place. Processes adjust without formal discussion. Expectations tighten, margins shrink. The system begins to arrange itself around what no longer fails. What was once a contribution becomes a position, and position changes how movement is interpreted. Competence does not seek attention, it attracts it indirectly, through the absence of problems, through the lack of complaint, through the gradual disappearance of alternatives. In production environments, this shift unfolds quietly. There are no ceremonies or acknowledgments. There is no clear moment of transition. Responsibilities accumulate without being reassigned. Dependencies form without being stated. Other options quietly fall away. From the system's perspective, nothing is wrong. Output remains stable, timelines hold, function is preserved. This episode observes that moment, not collapse or conflict, but the subtle transition where being very good at a function begins to alter one's freedom within a structure, not as punishment, not as reward, but as a consequence of becoming reliable in a way the system learns to depend on. Observation. In production environments, competence is rarely introduced. It reveals itself through repetition. The same output appears consistently. Errors decrease. Intervention becomes unnecessary. At first, this consistency is treated as relief. Fewer interruptions, less oversight required. Attention moves elsewhere. Competence blends into the background. Over time, the absence of problems becomes a signal. What does not require supervision begins to carry more weight. Tasks that must be completed without delay or variation are quietly directed toward what is known to function. This redirection is seldom explicit. There is no formal decision to concentrate responsibility. Work simply follows the path of least resistance. The reliable element becomes the default option. As this continues, competence starts to define tempo. Timelines are adjusted to match its speed. Output expectations recalibrate around its capacity. What was once exceptional becomes the new baseline. The system does not register this as dependency. It experiences it as optimization. From its internal perspective, efficiency has improved, but dependency forms nonetheless. As reliance increases, tolerance for variance decreases. The margin for error narrows around the competent element. Mistakes that were once absorbed by the system now stand out. This shift changes how deviation is perceived. A delay is no longer neutral. An inconsistency is no longer expected. Performance is measured against a pattern the system has grown accustomed to. At this stage, competence becomes legible to oversight. It is noticed not because it fails, but because its absence would be disruptive. Contingency planning begins to shrink. Alternatives are no longer rehearsed. Redundancy appears unnecessary. The system trusts the function to hold. This trust is uneven. It does not extend outward. It concentrates inward, narrowing around what is proven reliable. As a result, movement becomes constrained. Time off becomes noticeable. Absence requires explanation. Flexibility decreases without being formally revoked. The system rarely articulates this change. It does not issue new rules, it simply behaves differently around what it now depends on. Competence, in this context, does not expand freedom, it compresses it. Not through restriction, but through expectation. The individual or function becomes harder to replace. At the same time, it becomes harder to release. From the outside, nothing appears to have changed. Production continues, outputs remain stable, the environment looks calm. But inside the system, a recalibration has occurred. Competence has shifted from a quality to a position, and positions carry weight. This observation does not imply intention. Systems do not plan this outcome. They drift toward it. They follow what works, and in doing so, reorganize around it. By the time this pattern becomes visible, it is already established. Reliance has replaced choice. Efficiency has replaced flexibility. What remains is function that cannot easily move, not because it is constrained, but because too much depends on it staying where it is. When reliability becomes structure. Once competence has settled into a system, it begins to influence more than output. It affects how space, time, and attention are organized. In production environments, this influence is subtle. The competent function is not elevated, it is fixed in place. Schedules form around it. Dependencies align to it. Interruptions are avoided. What the system values most at this stage is not skill, but stability. Reliability becomes the preferred condition. Variation, even when harmless, introduces uncertainty. As a result, competence is treated less as a capacity and more as infrastructure. It is no longer something the system evaluates. It is something the system assumes. This assumption changes how decisions are made. When adjustments are required, they are made elsewhere. The reliable function is left untouched, not out of respect, but out of caution. Over time, this creates asymmetry. Other parts of the system remain flexible. They adapt, rotate, and absorb change. The competent element remains constant. Constancy produces visibility. When everything else moves, what stays fixed becomes a reference point, not formally, but practically. This reference status carries an unintended effect. Because the function holds, it becomes the limit. Capacity is inferred from past performance. Future expectations are shaped by previous results. The system stops asking what is possible. It begins assuming what will happen. At this point, competence no longer protects against scrutiny. It invites it. Not in the form of criticism, but in the form of measurement. Output is tracked more closely. Timelines are watched. Deviations are noticed immediately. What was once trusted now requires confirmation. This is not distrust. It is dependence attempting to secure itself. The system begins to fear interruption. Not because failure is likely, but because continuity has become essential. The idea of loss becomes more disruptive than the reality of constraint. As this fear settles in, protective behaviors appear. Access narrows, substitutes are avoided, knowledge remains concentrated, not by design, but by neglect. Redundancy feels inefficient, training alternatives feels unnecessary. The system leans further into what already works. In doing so, it increases its own vulnerability. Competence, now embedded, cannot easily be redistributed. Removing it would require redesign. Redesign introduces risk. Risk is postponed. What remains is a structure that depends on reliability while quietly restricting it. The competent function becomes stable, central, and difficult to move. From within the system, this feels like order. From the outside, it appears as efficiency. But what has occurred is a shift. Competence has stopped being a personal attribute. It has become a structural anchor. And anchors, once set, are not meant to drift. Machiavellian lens. Within systems of power, competence has never been a simple asset. It has always carried a secondary effect. Skill changes not only what gets done, but how authority must relate to what gets done. Power depends on execution, but it also depends on predictability. When execution becomes highly competent, those two dependencies begin to pull against each other. A capable function reduces error, it improves efficiency, it stabilizes outcomes. But it also reduces the need for intervention. It creates a space where authority is no longer required in every step. This is where caution enters. Power is most comfortable when effectiveness flows through it, not around it. When outcomes are achieved independently, even if beneficial, the center of gravity begins to shift. Competence introduces that shift quietly. At first, it appears helpful. The skilled function resolves issues before they escalate. It anticipates needs. It compensates for gaps elsewhere in the system. Authority benefits from this without having to engage directly. But over time, the relationship changes. What once felt like support begins to resemble autonomy. Decisions are made informally. Adjustments occur without consultation. Results appear without visible direction. This does not threaten output. It threatens visibility. Power does not require constant control, but it requires legibility. It must be able to see how outcomes are produced. Competence that operates smoothly can obscure its own process. From this lens, the problem is not excellence, it is independence. Highly capable functions reduce friction, but they also reduce reliance, and reduced reliance weakens the symbolic necessity of authority. Historically, those with technical mastery, operational expertise, or strategic knowledge were often treated with a mix of appreciation and restraint. They were retained, but rarely allowed to roam freely. Their value made them important, their importance made them risky. What cannot be easily replaced introduces leverage. Leverage alters balance. Balance must be corrected. Correction does not take the form of punishment, it takes the form of placement. The competent function is given a clear role. Its responsibilities are defined, its scope is bounded. Not to diminish it, but to contain its influence. This containment is often subtle. The system increases its involvement around the function. Checkpoints appear, reporting becomes routine, visibility increases. These measures are framed as coordination. In practice, they serve stabilization. As reliance deepens, the system becomes invested in continuity. Anything that might interrupt the function becomes a concern. Absence, transfer, or redirection now carries cost. The system begins to behave protectively. It discourages disruption without issuing prohibitions. It reshapes incentives rather than issuing commands. Movement becomes inconvenient. Change becomes slow. Alternatives remain undeveloped. Competence is not challenged. It is anchored. From a power perspective, anchoring is rational. What is essential must be preserved. Preservation requires predictability. Predictability requires control of conditions. The skilled function is therefore kept close to the center. Its environment becomes structured. Its variability is reduced. This does not appear as domination. It appears as responsibility. The more capable the function becomes, the more responsibility it carries. Responsibility accumulates. Expectations solidify. The role hardens. At a certain point, competence stops expanding possibility. It begins to define limits. What the system fears most is not disobedience, it is disruption. Competence that operates independently introduces the potential for both. To manage this, power narrows the range of acceptable movement. It ensures that what it relies on remains where it can be observed and accounted for. There is no confrontation in this process, no conflict is necessary. The arrangement unfolds gradually, guided by necessity rather than intent. The skilled function remains productive, output remains strong. From the outside, nothing appears constrained, but internally, the relationship has shifted. Competence has become indispensable. Indispensability has become leverage. Leverage has invited containment. From this lens, competence does not destabilize power by opposing it. It destabilizes power by reducing its visibility over outcomes. Power responds not by eliminating competence, but by absorbing it into structure. Once absorbed, the function is protected, relied upon, and fixed. And fixed functions, no matter how capable, are no longer free to redefine their position within the system. Modern framing, Green. In contemporary systems, competence rarely remains private. Visibility amplifies it. Performance is tracked, compared, and circulated even when no one explicitly asks for recognition. Modern structures reward what stands out. but they are uneasy with what cannot be easily redistributed. Excellence attracts attention, and attention alters how usefulness is treated. At first, competence is interpreted as initiative. Output improves, metrics rise, reliability becomes noticeable. The system responds with increased reliance. This reliance often arrives framed as trust. More responsibility is assigned, more problems are routed toward the same point. The competent function becomes the solution before alternatives are considered. In environments driven by performance indicators, this concentration feels logical. Why spread risk when one element consistently delivers results? But visibility changes the meaning of success. Once performance is legible, it becomes comparable. Once comparable, it becomes measurable. Once measurable, it becomes manageable. The system begins to organize around what performs best. Expectations are raised to match prior output. Timelines compress. The exceptional becomes standard. This shift is subtle. There is no declaration that the bar has moved. It simply does. As expectations rise, tolerance for deviation falls. What was once impressive becomes assumed. What was once flexible becomes fixed. Competence no longer signals potential, it signals obligation. In modern systems, usefulness is often framed as opportunity. More responsibility is offered, more involvement is requested, more visibility is granted. But opportunity carries weight. Being the most capable option makes withdrawal noticeable. Declining involvement requires explanation. Absence becomes disruption rather than neutrality. The system does not threaten, it pressures. Pressure accumulates through comparison. Others are measured against the competent function. The competent function is measured against its own past performance. There is no stable baseline. Output is expected to increase or remain high. Decline, even minor, attracts scrutiny. This scrutiny is not hostile, it is procedural. Reports are reviewed, timelines are questioned, adjustments are requested. The language remains neutral. The effect is cumulative. Over time, competence becomes a trap of consistency. The function must continue to deliver at a level it no longer controls. Past success becomes future obligation. In modern structures, being indispensable does not produce leverage, it produces exposure. Exposure invites management. The system begins to reduce uncertainty around the competent function. It seeks clarity, predictability, and continuity. Processes are formalized, access points are defined. What once felt like autonomy now feels like oversight. Not because control increased suddenly, but because the margin for variation disappeared. Alternatives remain theoretically available, but they are no longer developed. The system invests in what already works. Redundancy is postponed. This deepens dependence while narrowing choice. Visibility intensifies this effect. Performance data follows the function. Comparisons persist. Output is never fully forgotten. Competence becomes difficult to escape because it has become part of the system's expectation architecture. In this framing, standing out does not isolate a function socially, it isolates it structurally. The competent element becomes fixed in role, fixed in output range, fixed in expectation. Growth becomes vertical, not lateral. Movement becomes risky. What the system rewards is not freedom, but reliability. There is no accusation in this process, no blame, no overt demand for compliance. The pressure is ambient. It exists in metrics, timelines, assumptions, and comparisons. Modern systems do not need to suppress competence, they absorb it. Once absorbed, competence continues to function, continues to produce, and continues to appear successful. But its relationship to choice has changed. What began as standing out becomes being held in place. Psychological mechanism. As competence becomes embedded in a system, its effects are not only structural, they are internal. Perception begins to adjust before behavior does. At first, the competent function experiences increased demand as recognition. More reliance feels like validation. The system appears to notice what works. This perception holds as long as choice remains intact. Over time, however, the relationship shifts. Requests arrive more frequently. Expectations are no longer negotiated, they are assumed. What changes psychologically is not motivation, but reference. The baseline moves. Past performance becomes the measure of present adequacy. Success is no longer a point of arrival, it becomes a minimum condition. This creates a narrowing of internal options. What once felt elective now feels required. The competent function begins to operate ahead of demand, anticipating needs before they are voiced. Anticipation reduces friction. It also reduces visibility of effort. When effort disappears from view, output appears effortless. Effortlessness increases expectation. The system comes to rely not only on the function, but on its self-regulation. Problems are expected to be resolved internally. Escalation becomes a sign of deviation. As this expectation settles in, internal pressure increases without external force. The function begins to monitor itself more closely than the system does. Mistakes carry greater psychological weight, not because punishment is likely, but because disruption feels personal. Reliability becomes identity. This identification alters perception of risk. Saying no feels heavier. Slowing down feels conspicuous. Absence feels like exposure. The function adapts by narrowing behavior. Variability is reduced. Exploration is postponed. Stability becomes a personal responsibility. Psychologically, this is experienced as professionalism. The language around it is neutral, mature, responsible, but the effect is containment. The competent function internalizes the system's dependence. It begins to protect continuity on behalf of the structure, often without being asked. This self-protective alignment is efficient. It reduces the need for oversight. It keeps output stable. It also transfers the cost of stability inward. Over time, the function becomes less responsive to possibility and more responsive to expectation. Change is evaluated primarily in terms of disruption. Potential opportunities are filtered through risk. Lateral movement feels dangerous. Redefinition feels unjustified. The system does not need to impose these limits. They are adopted voluntarily. This internalization creates a feedback loop. Consistent delivery reinforces reliance. Reliance reinforces pressure. Pressure reinforces self-regulation. The loop tightens gradually. At no point does the function feel overtly constrained. There are no explicit barriers. There is only a growing sense that deviation would have consequences. This sense does not need to be accurate. It only needs to be plausible. Psychologically, competence becomes a contract without terms. The expectation is felt, not stated. The obligation is inferred, not assigned. As a result, freedom erodes quietly, not through restriction, but through anticipation. The function continues to perform well. From the outside, everything appears stable. Internally, however, the range of acceptable behavior has narrowed. Identity has fused with reliability. Choice has been reorganized around continuity. This is not anxiety, it is alignment. The competent function becomes aligned with the system's need to avoid disruption. It carries that need internally as if it were its own. This alignment is what allows the system to remain calm. Control no longer needs to be exercised, it is already in place. By the time the pressure is recognized, it feels normal. It has been integrated into how work is perceived and how responsibility is understood. Competence has not been resisted, it has been absorbed. And what is absorbed rarely remains free to redefine itself. Closing observation. Competence rarely enters a system with consequence attached to it. It appears as function. It proves itself through repetition rather than declaration. In the early stages, it feels expansive. Fewer obstacles appear, processes move with less friction. The system seems to open rather than narrow. But systems respond to reliability in predictable ways. What works is reused. What is reused becomes expected. What is expected begins to shape structure. This transition does not feel like control, it feels like efficiency. Adjustments are practical, dependencies are reasonable. No one appears to lose anything. Over time, however, competence stops being something the system notices and starts being something the system assumes. Assumption changes the relationship. What was once optional becomes necessary. What was once flexible becomes fixed. Absence begins to register. The system does not mark this shift explicitly. There is no announcement that freedom has changed. There is only a growing sense of obligation attached to continuity. Competence becomes a stabilizing force. Stability is rewarded with reliance. Reliance carries expectation. Expectation, once established, rarely relaxes. From the outside, nothing appears constrained. Output remains consistent, processes hold, the environment looks calm. Internally, the range of movement has narrowed, not through prohibition, but through consequence. This pattern does not require ambition or intent. It does not depend on overreach. It emerges naturally wherever function becomes essential. Power does not resist work, it reorganizes around it. And in reorganizing, it changes the meaning of being useful. What remains is work that functions well, is depended upon, and is increasingly difficult to move. Not because it is held back, but because too much now depends on it staying where it is. Until the next observation.